Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Aviva Arendine, Director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. The Hamilton Project is a nonpartisan organization that puts forward analysis and policy proposals to support broad-based economic growth. This month marks the 10th anniversary of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which reauthorized and made significant changes to the measurement and accountability frameworks put in place by the earlier No Child Left Behind. The anniversary is a chance to take stock of the state of student achievement today, including the ongoing impacts of pandemic-related disruptions, and to evaluate the future of education policy. In just a few minutes, Brookings Senior Fellow Jon Valant will moderate a roundtable discussion on these topics. Following that discussion, we're honored to be joined by Maryland State Superintendent Carey Wright and Matt Barnum of Chalkbeat for a fireside chat. Superintendent Wright was appointed State Superintendent of Schools by the Maryland State Board of Education in April 2024. A native Marylander, she previously served as State Superintendent of Education in Mississippi from 2013 to 2022, and she is credited with elevating Mississippi to become a national leader in literacy instruction. In conjunction with today's event, the Hamilton Project released an analysis and data interactive this morning that examined the relationship between COVID-related disruptions and learning trajectories for students in different cohorts. To ask questions during the event, follow us at @HamiltonProj and use the hashtag ESSA, or send an email to info@hamiltonproject.org. Jon, I'll now turn things over to you to introduce the panel.
Thanks, Aviva, and thank you all for joining us. I have the privilege today of moderating a panel discussion with three terrific panelists. We have with us Kirabo Jackson, who is the Abraham Harris Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. Dr. Jackson is an economist who specializes in issues such as teacher labor markets and school funding, and he previously served on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. We have Brian Jacob, who is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of Education Policy and Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and Education at the Ford School at the University of Michigan. Dr. Jacob has studied many aspects of education policy and has done some especially influential work on K-12 standards and accountability. And Brian was also a former middle school teacher. And we have Susanna Loeb, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Dr. Loeb is an economist who specializes in education policy. She's focused on a number of issues, including teacher labor markets, school finance, and early childhood education. And of late, she's become a leading voice on high-impact tutoring, having founded the National Student Support Accelerator and worked with schools across the country. I should say, too, Susanna was also my dissertation advisor, and it's kind of fun to be on the other side of the question asking this time around. So before we get started, I'm going to spend just a minute or two to give kind of a big picture to sort of set the table, because we do have a lot of issues on our plate right now. We're going to be talking about the Every Student Succeeds Act. And really, the story of the Every Student Succeeds Act goes back to the mid-1960s and LBJ's War on Poverty. So Congress passed and LBJ signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESSA, in 1965, and its primary purpose was really to get some funds and resources to U.S. students, and particularly to students who were at risk of their needs going unmet. So we often think now about Title I. Title I was kind of a signature core part of ESSA. And ESSA, as the big piece of federal legislation, was tinkered with over the years. The most substantial revision came when it was reauthorized in 2001, 2002 as No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind really marked a real change in the federal role in education, in that the federal government became much more assertive in trying to define what happened in schools. It was the key piece of legislation in the test-based accountability era, and it required states to administer annual assessments in certain grades and subjects. The focus was primarily on math and reading in grades 3 through 8, but there were some other tests and grade levels involved too. And each year, through NCLB, schools had to meet state-defined benchmarks for student proficiency. And that was overall for all students and also for some subgroups. And NCLB was aimed at getting to the ambitious goal, or maybe the unrealistic goal, of getting 100% of students proficient by the year 2014. So that's NCLB. And there were sanctions, too, as part of NCLB. So schools that failed to make adequate yearly progress toward those benchmarks risked being punished with punishments that were laid out in the legislation. And by the mid-2010s, there was a lot of NCLB fatigue, and it really was both among Democrats and among Republicans. There were concerns about there being too much testing, about schools spending too much time preparing for tests, and about a policy that was too punitive. And there were also just kind of broader concerns about whether the federal government was too engaged in education. And so that brings us to the Every Student Succeeds Act, where in 2015, Congress passed and President Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was, again, the reauthorization of ESSA. So we're now at that 10-year mark. And the kind of big important thing to know about ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, is that it really kind of pulled back on the federal role. So it softened some of the harder edges of NCLB. It still requires annual testing, but states now have more flexibility in using measures other than test scores in their accountability systems. They have some opportunity to use innovative assessments that are a bit different from what would have been allowed under NCLB. States can set their own goals so that they're no longer obligated to sort of march toward that 100% proficiency mark. And they can also decide how to respond to schools that aren't performing well. So federal legislation kind of kept that framework of standards and accountability, but really had a much lighter touch than it did with NCLB. And I'll say too, just very briefly, and I'll invite the panelists to disagree with my read on this, but if we look at student performance over this time period, so the NCLB period to now is roughly 2001, 2002 until today, what we saw increases in student test scores in the early years of NCLB, and actually quite substantial increases. And I'm talking especially about our nation's report card, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And we started to see those scores plateau in the mid-2010s and then started to decline probably around 2015 or so, and then really precipitously dropped with COVID. So we had this sort of improvement, plateau, decline, precipitous drop, and it's only bounced back kind of ever so slightly. And the declines that we've seen have not been shared equally across all students. Just to highlight one place where I think we've seen some really notable trends, the gaps between our highest scoring students and our lowest scoring students have steadily grown. So we have our sort of educational haves and have-nots are really farther apart now than they have been in some time. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists. I'll start with Kirabo, and then we'll go to Brian and Susanna. I'm going to ask you just to kind of reflect on where we are. So we're 10 years into the Every Student Succeeds Act. We're about 5 or 6 years past the initial wave of COVID. How do you see the state of America's schools and education systems right now, and how do you sort of assess the moment we're in? Oh.
Thanks, John, and thanks for that overview of how we got here. So yeah, I think first I just want to say like a little bit of a shout out or a plug for No Child Left Behind. You know, it got a lot of bad press for being an unfunded mandate and being too narrow, and I think many of the criticisms were true. But I think one of the most important things that it did, which you highlighted, is that it really ushered in a new era of testing and basically data collection. So I think as a result of No Child Left Behind, we now have a data collection sort of infrastructure that has shed light on a lot of things, a lot of patterns within states. We have information on what's happening to particular districts. We have information on what's happening to particular students within schools. So we now have a much better sense of which students are not performing up to the standard that we'd like. We're thinking about low-income students versus more affluent students. We're thinking of minority students versus non-minority students. We're thinking of students who come in with English as a second language or not. So we have a much better sense of where the potential challenges are. Thinking of urban schools, rural schools also have particular challenges. And I think one of the things that we now have a much better handle on is where these gaps are, where the fault lines are in terms of academic measures. As you mentioned, it's math and English language arts. But, you know, I think one of the biggest criticisms of No Child Left Behind was that it was potentially too narrow. So, you know, there's now a lot of research. I've done a lot of work on this. Susanna has as well. Basically documenting the fact that like test scores as measured on a standardized test are a pretty narrow set of skills. They're absolutely very important set of skills that schools are responsible for, but it doesn't capture all the skills that schools really do impart on kids. You know, if you look at the data and you sort of figure out the effect of schools on, say, test scores, And then you measure school effects on broader measures like socio-emotional measures, things that you can capture with things like course grades as distinct from standardized tests or attendance, these kinds of measures, or also psychometric measures that measure things like student engagement, student well-being. School impacts on these sort of softer measures are often as predictive for student success in going to college, graduating college, as the school impacts on test scores. So what I think that tells us is that the narrow focus on test scores in grades 3 through 8 was probably missing out a lot of important information about the things that schools need to be doing, as schools should be doing, to ensure that we have an educated population. And I think one of the real things I like about ESSA is that they expanded the set of things that could be included in the accountability system or in just in the measurement system in general. So, economists often say that, measuring something is to some extent its own form of accountability. If you measure something, you're basically focusing attention on that thing. And I think that's a good thing. Now, I would say that we still have a long way to go in terms of the broader measures that schools and districts are using to measure student success. But I think just the fact that we're now considering broader measures such as things like the graduation rate in high school or the attendance rate, which is a crude proxy for the extent to which students are engaged, is really a step in the right direction because, where we are right now is, after COVID, as you mentioned, we had test score declines after the pandemic. And, people called it learning loss, and learning loss was a story for many years. But other things that have crept up in the data is we're seeing much more elevated levels of students who are not engaged. We're seeing higher levels of students who are chronically absent. We're seeing lower levels of students who are sort of actively engaged in the school. And I think that's a problem. If students aren't in the So I think we have a broader problem. We have increases in terms of reported mental health among the school-age population. All those things mean that we're in a moment where test scores matter, but those broader things that ESSA potentially allows us to measure also matter considerably. And we're in a moment where we need to figure that out. So I would just say on an optimistic note, I think we do have some of the infrastructure to figure out where the problems are, and what populations need some attention. But I think the challenge is, which I know we're going to talk about, how do we roll that out to ensure that everyone does well?
Thanks very much, Bo. Brian, I'll hand it over to you. Same question. So how do you kind of assess where we are now, 10 years into ESSA and a good 5 to 6 years into the COVID?
Yeah, let's see. I guess I would definitely like to agree with a lot of what Bo said. I think one of the biggest benefits of No Child Left Behind was the data collection infrastructure. And I think that's a lesson we can and should take moving forward to expand that even more to capture some of these types of measures that Bo had talked about, in addition to looking at other grade levels that really weren't a focus of No Child Left Behind. So where are we now? I mean, I think it's clear. I mean, like the kids in the U.S. really are kids and families are really struggling. I mean, I think you noted the NAEP test scores, and I think it's really, really important to like emphasize that started well before COVID. I mean, you said 2015. I think depending on the grade level and the subject, sometimes it's closer to 2013 or even 2011 when the peak was. So this is not really a COVID phenomenon. I think there's lots of people have been trying to figure out like what was the cause of the stagnation. I don't think there's one particular explanation that's going to explain everything. But I think young people are struggling in the U.S. I think one other theme that like the shift from No Child Left Behind in the years following has kind of emphasized for me that I know we're going to get into more is kind of the issue of decentralization versus centralization. I mean, I think one of the benefits of No Child Left Behind was it focused everyone's attention on a kind of a modest, maybe some may say even too narrow, but kind of a clear set of objectives. There was a lot of benefit of that sort of like focus and clarity. I think since NCLB waivers started coming online in 2011, and then certainly in ESSA, there's been just a lot of decentralization, and kind of states have handled this very differently. And I think some states, Mississippi being one of them, seems to have done a great job in kind of like focusing all of the educators in the state around a set of core objectives, early literacy skills. I mean, other states have really had a much more laissez-faire approach. And I think that is one of the reasons we're seeing some of the growing gaps between the have and the have-nots, is because there are some places that don't have the capacity that they need. And in a decentralized system, they are going to fall farther and farther behind. So I think that is a challenge facing kind of lots of places in the US now. And right, I think there's some more broader like social phenomenon, kind of like social media and cell phone use, kind of engagement with school, and kind of folks' thoughts about the value of schooling in the post-COVID era. Broader societal issues as well. But maybe I'll stop there, and I know we're going to have lots of more detailed discussions.
Thanks, Brian. And I'd note too that some of these challenges aren't unique to the US. So to kind of put our scores into some context, if you look at the last round of international test score comparisons for 15-year-olds, relative to other OECD countries, so other relatively wealthy countries, we're below average in math. We're actually very high scoring in reading relative to other countries, and we're kind of a little bit above average in science. And a lot of those countries have kind of mimicked our trend line to some extent, not quite to the degree that we have, but it's not that we aren't sort of doing this in total isolation. And also, Brian, I appreciate the plug for Carey Wright, who we'll be chatting with right after this session, so you can hear a bit about what they did in Mississippi and what is it that seems to have worked. Susanna, to you. So your thoughts on kind of where we are right now?
Yeah, so not surprisingly, I'm going to agree a lot with Bo and Brian. So I think, and thanks for having me here today. This should be a really fun conversation. So I see a system that's facing serious challenges, whether it's because of the relaxation from the incentives of No Child Left Behind or cell phones or the pandemic. But we also have one that is equipped with more knowledge and better capacity building resources and greater alignment than certainly what it was when we all began our careers. The challenges are pretty clear. You talked about them, and I love that you noted that the achievement declines began well before COVID, even though they were accelerated by COVID. And also that chronic absenteeism has gone up a lot. So this indication, I think, doubled really. There are something like 6.5 million additionally chronically absent students in the US. It's a huge problem. So we have this problem both from before the pandemic and exacerbated by the pandemic. But amid these challenges, we also have some real strengths. So we're more aligned around the goals for schools than we were 40 years ago, even with all the political conflicts that we have. So the NCLB introduced, and the accountability movement before that, introduced testing and data, but it also introduced standards. We spent a lot of time thinking about what students should learn in history, in science, in math, in all these different subject areas. We didn't have that before. The NCLB and all of those policies forced an explicit conversation about what students should learn. And what was also really important, and you noted this briefly, is the attention wasn't only on the average student, but on subgroups that had long been underserved. So students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, English learners, different racial and ethnic groups. And that focus really mattered. So the disaggregated data and incentives of accountability produced some of the largest gains we'd seen in our whole trajectory among the lowest achieving students. So while in these last few years, we've seen a huge loss for those lowest performing students, but the NCLB era saw a big gain for those students. with the standards and then getting some tests aligned to some of the standards. Some of our standards don't have tests associated with them, but certainly in reading and math, this enabled a wave of research that dramatically improved our understanding of what works in education. So tutoring, which is what I worked on, what I've been working on is one, but early literacy approaches, stronger curriculum, coaching, all sorts of things like that. We know a lot more about that. We moved away from the incentives in NCLB, and I think we'll talk more about that here because that's what ESSA kind of illustrates. But most states still see their role as setting standards and helping students work towards those standards. So the state of K-12 education today is serious challenges, and we all know that, especially declines in achievement and engagement, but also this clarity, data, strategic alignment among educators, more than we've had in the past. And so I think the question now is whether we can leverage that foundation and all the changes to technology and the economy to really drive this next era of improvement.
Can I add a little bit
Please.
to that? So I mean, one thing I want to mention is, I guess, also related to what you let out with John, was about the timing of when the declines happen. So I think one explanation that hasn't been mentioned yet is just the role of money. Now, I think, if you look over time, just historically, turns out like the Great Recession was actually the first time that per pupil spending actually fell for the first time ever. So it had always been going up over time. Critics of spending have made that point, but right after the Great Recession was the first time we actually saw spending decline in real terms. Scored growth basically stalled and then started to dip. I've done some research looking into whether those declines were more pronounced in areas that saw the biggest reductions in spending, and the answer there was yes. So I just want to highlight the fact that, money does matter, resources do matter, and I don't know that we're going to be able to just sort of innovate our way out of this necessarily without some additional funds. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that money is going to solve all the problems. It's not a panacea. All the things that Brian's talking about, Susanna's talking about, in terms of finding the models that work, finding the specific inputs that are going to improve outcomes, absolutely, that's the way we're going to improve things. But we do need resources to make sure that actually happens.
Yeah, thank you. And Brian, you kind of teed up that response when you said that there are a lot of different explanations for why it is that we saw that stagnation and then the decline in the mid 2010s. I am curious, even if there's not one single response or one single explanation, I'm curious, and Susanna, feel free to jump in here too, about how you interpret that. Like, why is it that we saw such steady and really significant improvements over an extended period, and that they tapered off and then started to reverse?
Let's see. I mean, I think one, I think there was kind of like the pullback from accountability, and that was kind of just maybe a change in focus and effort around kind of the core math and reading achievement. That I think funding played a big role in that, may have played a big role. Like Bo's research said, it definitely does explain some of the achievement declines, kind of certainly post Great Recession. I think kind of like the rise of social media and cell phones is a likely suspect. I mean, it's really hard to get kind of definitive, conclusive evidence on this. Let's see. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the kind of like the opioid and meth epidemics, like kind of that were increasing over some of these time periods, might have been part of it. Yeah, I mean, I think those are just a few. I'm sure other people, like Susanna, you might have other candidate explanations. Right. And I guess one other, well, go ahead, Susanna.
No, actually, I was just listening to you. So keep going.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I would love us, a theme in addition to the centralization, decentralization, I think one thing that I often try to keep in mind when I think about education policy issues is that, like, the issues and potentially the solutions, I think, will vary dramatically by grade level. Like, I think if we're talking about kind of early literacy, K through grade 3, like, what are some of the explanations and some of the potential solutions may be really, really different than when we're talking about kind of early adolescence, kind of high school, 9th and 10th graders. I mean, chronic absenteeism is just a perfect example. I mean, there's been chronic absenteeism along all like age levels, but what's causing like the kindergartner to be chronically absent is very different likely than what's causing the 9th and 10th grader to be chronically absent. Um, and yeah, so I mean, I think when we think about kind of causes and potential solutions, I think it's really useful to think about at least the broad age categories.
One thing I would
Yeah, please.
So one thing I would just sort of just piggyback on that a little bit is on sort of causes and solutions is like it's from my perspective, it's not always necessary that the causes tell us what the solution is going to be. The kind of the example I typically give is like we know that like some people don't have great eyesight and that's by genetics, but the fix is basically glasses. It's not to fix the genetics, so it's not obvious. So I think there are many causes, and I think the causes in the different settings are going to require a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach to addressing them. But I just want to highlight the fact that just because the cause may be A, doesn't mean that the solution is going to be to get rid of A. The solution could be something quite different. For example, thinking of high dosage tutoring, for example, that's a solution that is distinct, whatever the cause may be. If someone's a grade level behind, I think those things are pretty effective. Just want to highlight that.
So what does that mean now for how we think about ESSA? So we're a decade into ESSA. It's a complicated time period that ESSA has overlapped with. I mean, it's COVID, it's changes to the economy. There's a lot going on right now. And we're in a moment where people are wanting to know something and kind of know what to think about this big, important piece of federal legislation. Is it too messy for us to draw strong conclusions, or do you have thoughts on what we should make of the move from NCLB to ESSA? What worked or what didn't work, and can we even know?
Yeah, these things are really, really tricky to kind of pin down exactly what the causes of things are. But I do think there was a clear pullback on accountability when moving from NCLB to ESSA. And you can see the results of that. You can see less focus on schools that are struggling. You can see a kind of take up of measures that are less easily comparable across places. So I think there are things that you can see from ESSA. I think what's tricky is that I'm not quite sure how useful it is to know exactly the effect of this one program. What happened with NCLB, I think, as we talked about, is it provided a lot of good things. It clarified what students should know. It focused attention on subgroups. It created incentives. It created data infrastructures. But there were problems that emerged and problems that it needed to change. There were not a lot of people saying we have to keep NCLB exactly as it is, because it was set up as something that was in some ways unachievable in the end, because 100% proficient was really hard to get to. And so it was going to have a failure point. So then the question is, what do you do and what do you learn from that? And I think we learned a couple of things. And I think the most important thing that we learned overall is that incentives are really, really important, and you need capacity building to go along with those incentives. So you need to do things to help places that aren't improving. Part of improving is alignment and effort, and NCLB did that well. But part of improving is really getting into the nitty-gritty of what works and then helping bring that capacity to schools and for schools to develop some of that capacity internally. And so I think we're in a time where we can see that both of those things are important. I think ESSA maybe didn't have the accountability that it needs to get there, but it was really trying to think through some of those things, because we saw in NCLB's failure, kind of a failure of setting goals right, a failure in narrowing our focus too much. So moving the focus to students is good. Really narrowing tunnel vision down to one single test or two tests is not probably where we want it to go. So I think it was inevitable that you would need a change. And now we're just, I think, in a period of struggling to figure out what is the right balance in terms of accountability.
Well, Brian, would you agree with that? Do you have a similar view of the kind of downsides that needed to be responded to?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. I think that's right. I mean, I like some of my research has kind of found quite positive impacts of NCOB, especially on math. But I am one of the first people to say that like it had a lot of problems too, and it couldn't continue in its current in its form that it existed in. I really don't. I don't know. I think it's almost impossible with all the various factors going on in the country to say was ESSA a success or not. I mean, I think it's clear that there should be something else and something different now. What would that be? I mean, I guess in the effort to be controversial or maybe specific, I can throw out a few things, and I think there's always like a trade-off. Like if something needs to happen, like what is the right level of government for in which that to happen? Like, I mean, I think there's a question of federal versus state versus local. I would like to see kind of the feds mandating testing down to some sort of testing down to kindergarten through third grade. I mean, I think one of the big challenges we have kind of nationally with getting literacy, kind of basic literacy measured at third or fourth grade up to where most educators and parents would like it is because, again, at a broad national level, the first time we, and that's researchers, policymakers, in some cases, parents or educators, first understand kind of the literacy of children is almost at the end of the process, right? When they're supposed to be kind of reading at some basic level. So I would like to see at least literacy assessments kind of nationwide and some sort of comparable, consistent, publicly reported measure down to when schooling starts and when literacy efforts start. Along those same lines, I'd like to see some more consistency of post eighth grade assessments. Really, the NCOB requirements was one test in reading and math, kind of any kind of test at any grade level throughout high school. Just do whatever you want, and as a result, I think it's quite hard to know how well do our students, kind of high school students, doing on some core skills. So I think that's one thing I would throw out.
Can I follow up on that? So that's interesting, and there are some states that are moving in that direction of actually pushing farther down the path of test-based accountability. And are you thinking of that in terms? So we think of standards, we think of assessment, we think of accountability sometimes as a package where a state might set standards and then write assessments that test students' knowledge of those, mastery of those standards, and then hold schools accountable for their performance. Are you thinking of that if we're looking at assessment, federally mandated assessments for kids in grades K2 or in high school as kind of the complete package there? So is that test-based accountability as we've come to understand test-based accountability? And if it is, how do we kind of get past the fatigue that we talked about earlier, where it just, there was a sense around the country that there was too much testing and the tests were just driving a little too much of what was happening in schools?
Let's see. I think I am was focused mostly on the standards and assessment part. And in terms of the test fatigue, I think in practice, most schools and most districts that I know of are doing assessment in K1 and 2. It's just not very standardized and not publicly reported and disaggregated. So I would like to think there's a way to kind of accomplish the goal of having publicly reported and kind of comparable transparent assessments at K2 without adding to the number of assessments that is out there. Because I mean, I'm a parent of 3, and I know very well all of the testing that my kids have gone through, and it's not always that productive. So I don't think we need more, but I think we need some that is kind of more consistent, comparable, and public.
Susanna and Bo. So Brian has this provocative proposal now. So we're gonna suspend disbelief for a second and pretend that Congress were capable of reauthorizing ESSA again, and we have whatever comes after ESSA. I'm curious how you would feel about kind of pushing those testing requirements from the federal legislation beyond the grades that they're now to really kind of expand standards in assessment, even if accountability looks a bit different in the future. Any reactions to that?
I'll go quick. So in many ways, I agree with Brian on this. I do think we're at a stage where our assessments could get much different and much better. And for example, in the early grades, you don't need to have 4 hours to test early reading. You can do it in a much more kind of computer-assisted way than we've done in the past. And I think we can cut down. We're also much better at processing data than we were in the past. So because with all of this kind of technological advancement, you can shorten the amount of time each student spends on assessments, and you can get that information back to schools and districts quickly so that it can be useful, unlike what we used to do, which was this long test, and then it would go away and come back actually in the next school year. So it really wasn't very useful. So I think what I would have as part of ESSA is actually developing some better assessments and assessment systems so that its information could be there. And I think early literacy is a great example, because we really need to know that, not only we need to know that so we know which schools really need supports, and at the micro level, we need it so we know which students need supports and how to give them exactly what they need and to target their learning so they're not learning stuff they already know. And we know that's a big problem in the early grades, that we're just reteaching things they know, but also that they have what they need to learn the next thing. So I think assessment and processing is really important. And I actually think it's important because there are other kinds of capacities, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that given the new technology in the world, and actually we've always needed these capacities and haven't been able to measure them, like being able to work together in a group and being creative and all of those kinds of things, that we are going to have eventually an ability to measure and scaffold those things that could really help a lot of students later in the workforce and in life. So I think part of what the federal government should be doing is an investment in trying to understand kind of what we want for students, how do we measure those in ways that can really support the school system, so that we can be more broad, be more in terms of measures, so that they can really be focused on things that help students in the long run.
I'm going to be really boring and agree with both Susanna and Brian on this. I'll just add a little bit that I think, a key point, which I think oftentimes gets gobbled up in the politics of this. First thing people think about is, okay, this is going to be used in some punitive way to sort of punish people who are not doing well or something along those lines. And I think one thing that can happen potentially, especially when we start to think about these broader, richer measures that are highly predictive, is to think about what could we measure in a way that would not only be useful to just for diagnostics. So separating basically evaluation from sort of diagnosing issues, so we can identify. So kind of exactly like what Susanna said, like if we can put together an infrastructure to measure things that are useful, that could actually be provided to teachers and schools so they could use those data, that would be tremendously valuable. I don't know that some of the ways in which certainly No Child Left Behind was done was that way. You sort of got a report at some point in time, but it wasn't necessarily used within the schooling environment in a data-driven way. So I think that one of the potential benefits of having broader measures, and one of the things we could do as an opportunity, is to think about using these data, designing them in a way that could actually be really helpful for schools. And I think the decentralization, the fact that some of the decision-making processes happen at lower levels of government can potentially facilitate a little bit of feedback from the schools or the district to the state to think about what the measures may be that could be useful for them figuring that kind of stuff out.
This question of centralization versus decentralization has come up a few times, and I'm curious on how are you thinking about that and what we've learned on that? Susanna, go ahead.
I can take a shot. I mean, I think the pandemic was a really interesting place to look for some of this, because in some states, schools and districts were making decisions on things, particularly schools seem unreasonable, on things like the HVAC system. That doesn't seem like something that should be done kind of locally at the school level to make sure the air is safe. It's just not the capacity of the people who are running schools. You want them there responding to students, making sure that school is both joyful and beneficial in the long run for students. And so I really think we need to think about what are good decisions to be made locally, and how can the upper levels of government help take away some of the decisions from the local areas so they can really focus on what they should be doing and what they have the skills to be doing. And so the HVAC system is one example where I don't think that's a local skill very much, but you can imagine other things. I know I've been doing a lot of interviews around the state and that I'm in California, and we see principals and school leaders struggling to make the decisions of which curriculum they should use, because there's so many and it's so complicated. There's reasons for higher levels of government to come in and say, these are the better curriculum, or even let's just choose this one and go with it, because then once we have one, we can make all these decisions together and a student can move from your school to that school and there's some alignment in it. So I think there are real reasons that not everything is decided locally, both for capacity, like knowledge and time, and also just that we live in a national country and students move and we can learn from each other. And so I think this question of centralization and decentralization is really important. And we just have to figure out balances between the benefits of local decision making and the real pressures that higher levels of government can take off local decision makers so that they can be more effective in their work.
So I want to sort of to piggyback on that, which is I think separate from the question of like, what is the optimal level at which decisions can be made? I think there's also this a question of capacity, which has come up as well. And I'm doing some research right now in Chicago, and it's looking at basically a program or policy where they basically afforded greater decision-making authority to principals, but only principals who had already demonstrated that they were doing well already. So the idea there was that they said, okay, we're going to give you more people who've looked at research on this and found that like exactly what Susanna described, which is some principals felt kind of overwhelmed. They're like, oh my goodness, that they didn't want to have to make all these new decisions. They felt a loss of support, and they actually some of their results actually were hurt by that. Other principals, on the other hand, really loved the fact that they were able to make decisions, tailor them to their kids, to their students, and their outcomes improved. So I think you could almost think of a marrying of accountability and autonomy or decentralization in a way we say, look, it's almost a flip of what some places did with No Child Left Behind, which is if you do poorly, we're going to take away your autonomy. We could do the opposite and say, if you do really well, we're going to grant you greater autonomy because clearly you know what you're doing. So I think we can do both things. And I absolutely agree that we have to think about what decisions are ideal for different levels, but also we have to think about the local capacity. I think right now schools are doing a lot that they weren't necessarily doing before. You have a lot more people, there's social workers in schools, there's just a constellation of things that schools are doing now that they were not paying attention to, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And I think being mindful about who you give authority to, who you give autonomy to, thinking very clearly about who has capacity to handle those decisions, I think can both be a motivating tool, because I think also, local school districts and also principals, they value autonomy, but also thinking about making sure that we have guardrails. We have to make sure that there are some standards that are maintained everywhere else. But I think we have to try to find that balance. I think ESSA does afford that kind of balance if implemented correctly.
And Brian, you're welcome to jump in. We also have some nice questions coming in from audience members that I'm happy to jump to. So, beginning with, and this one comes from Harsha, AI is changing the world, and Harsha's wondering how it's changing K-12 accountability and performance. And if I could, I actually want to draw in a comment that I think I heard you mention, Susanna, that we may need to think a little bit differently about what skills and knowledge and disposition students have going forward. I mean, I think there are a lot of discussions right now about what is the economy and the society that our kids are going to be entering when they leave school. So this question is for any of you, but how are you thinking about everything that AI is reshaping as it comes to what it is that students should learn and what we need to be testing and how accountability fits into all of that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of accountability in schools that we haven't really been talking about. For example, just the accountability of a teacher assessing how a student is learning in the classroom and then building off of that. And so I guess where I'm going I think there are two sides of the AI. One is like what skills they need later on. And I think there are different skills, but I also think we needed some of those skills before. But what it allows us to do in schools may be really wonderful in some ways. So we know that there are a lot of ways of learning that are more engaging, more creative, more exciting to students, projects and apprenticeships and all sorts of things, but we haven't really been able to use them because it's too complicated for a teacher to be able to monitor whether all the students are getting what they need to get in these more creative situations. And they need to monitor that, not just so they can give the students a grade, but so that they know how to kind of incentivize them internally to keep going, to tell them that they're doing a good job on something, to scaffold if they need help figuring out how to come up with an idea or work together in a difficult group. So I think what AI may provide us in just this assessment and accountability range is the ability to get some of that information from more complicated, more fun tasks so that the accountability for students helps them develop some of these skills that we haven't been able to be focused on, but also allows them to develop skills like math in a much more organic, creative kind of thing, because they're building something and they need to do division or they need to get angles. And we can pick that up now because it's not just a teacher picking it up, because we can pick that up from these new kind of AI tools for measurement. So I do think that there are great things that we can do on measurement, on giving individual students more direct supports that are targeted towards them. But we're still in a place where we need humans to do that, because humans are motivating and engaging and fun, and they're really what the world is about. But I'm optimistic that AI can help us leverage better educational approaches than we've been using before.
And Brian or Bo?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with Susanna. I mean, I think there's like two pieces. One that Susanna focused on. I mean, I think there's like AI is going to have is going to have an incredible impact on kind of helping students learn and helping teachers teach. I mean, one thing that Susanna didn't mention specifically, but I know she's been working on in some research of hers, is there's a lot of AI tools that like are focused around kind of teacher work and helping them do what they do better and more efficiently, and saving them time so they can really put in the time working with individual children. I mean, in terms of, does AI radically change the whole nature of knowledge and what students need to learn? I mean, I maybe in some modest ways, yes, but I worry that's going to be a distraction. I think that, fundamentally, students need basic literacy, basic numeracy, critical thinking skills, and kind of like kind of non-cognitive social or intrapersonal skills. And I think that's what they have needed before. I mean, that's what they have needed for years. And certainly when we had the computer revolution in the 80s and the internet revolution before, we said, oh, they need critical thinking and they need so I think a lot of the fundamentals are still there, and there might be some modest changes or, but for better or worse, I think for better, I don't think we need to radically rethink what education needs to do. And I worry, I would caution people against that, because I think that would be a distraction from some of the key challenges we already face.
I'm going to be boring again and agree strongly with what Brian just said. Like I'm just not on this whole AI is going to radically change what we need to know train at all. Unless the nature of AI changes dramatically from what it is right now, my sense of what it is it's still a tool. And I think it actually potentially, to get to the question of like what the skills are that we're going to need, I think it probably raises the premium on having that sort of this critical thinking quite a bit. I think we're now at a point now where you can ask an AI to do something, and it gives you an answer pretty quickly. It's an answer that may have taken you an hour to do. It can do it in like 5 minutes, but then there's a 20% chance that what you got is nonsense. And in order to figure out whether what you got is nonsense or not, you have to actually understand the material. And I think those critical skills are going to be really important. So I think for people who want to do jobs, who want to get those really high-powered jobs where you simply can't get it wrong, the AI is just not doing that yet. It's just not up to the task yet. And I think having the critical skills to be able to use AI as a tool to increase your productivity while being able to figure out what is nonsense and what is not, what's a hallucination versus what is not, I think there's going to be a lot of premium on that skill. That premium is really going to be on being able to write prompts, understand prompts, and have enough content knowledge and understanding to really figure out the wheat from the chaff. I think that the premium on that is going to be quite high, because people who can do that, they're going to be able to use the AI tools and they're going to boost their productivity 20-30%. So I guess I don't know that is the only thing that we should be focusing on, but I think I think the content knowledge is there. We have to know basic numeracy and literacy, because again, AI makes mistakes. It's actually built into the way the models work that you have a degree of randomness to it. So I don't think it's going to transform the skills in a dramatic way that students need to know. I think we've always needed these skills. We've always needed critical thinking, but I think it probably shifts the emphasis a little bit more on critical thinking, because that's less of the kinds of things that AI can do.
So
And
how
I do think,
optimistic?
sorry,
Oh, sorry.
John,
Go ahead, Susanna.
one quick thing, and I think it allows us to measure it better. And I think that's important. So sorry.
It's exactly my question for both. So both, you have done a lot of work on this, and you've mentioned in this conversation that we need to expand what it is that we're measuring, what kinds of student outcomes we're measuring. How do you feel optimistic that some of these new tools, as we start to roll them out, will help us do that much better than we have?
Was that for myself or for Susanna?
No, for you both.
Yeah, I think, I'm optimistic that we'll find some measures. So I think we are a long ways from knowing exactly what we need to measure, to be blunt. And I think that's not the fault of policymakers. I think even as researchers, we're still figuring out what exactly these measures should be. But I do think it's really helpful that we have a policy framework that allows for experimentation in that regard. And I think as long as we put some emphasis on that, so to the point about the fact that maybe we pulled back from accountability a little bit, maybe if we injected a little bit more in there, or perhaps put some incentives to come up with measures, I think I'm optimistic that we can get there. We're not there yet by any stretch. I would say there probably needs to be, in my opinion, some investment at the federal level in measurement. I think we need to have greater investment at the federal level to fund research in measurement, to get a sense of what these things are. Much in the same way, like we had investments to fund, like psychometrics is a whole field. Testing is something that it's many years of research of have come together to design the kinds of tests that states and districts use. I think we need to have something similar for these broader measures. We're not there yet, but I think it'd be helpful for the federal government, because I think that's exactly the level at which that kind of investment has to happen, to put money into that kind of designing the research that would basically facilitate that. But I think we have some measures now that are doing something. They definitely have value added, but they are by no means, I think, where the end game could be.
Terrific. I think we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. This could go much longer than this, but a big thank you to all three of our panelists for a wonderful conversation. And I want to leave time here for the fireside chat that follows. And I'm going to hand off right now to Matt Barnum. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a great panel and a hard panel to follow. But luckily, I have a great guest to follow with, Dr. Carey Wright. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Matt Barnum. I'm an editor and columnist at Chalkbeat Ideas, a new section devoted to exploring big ideas and big questions in American education. I'm thrilled to be here to discuss some of these big issues with Maryland Superintendent Carey Wright. I couldn't think of a better person to chat with. Dr. Wright and I were talking beforehand. This is officially a fireside conversation. We do not have a fire, but we are going to try to keep the conversation warm and inviting. You can email questions to info@hamiltonproject.org. And if it's a good question, I might ask it. Before I jump into questions with Superintendent Wright, I'll just offer my own very brief commentary to build off the excellent panel before us. My most recent story actually focused on what I called the new nostalgia for No Child Left Behind, since test scores were rising during that era and have flatlined or declined since. I dove into the research evidence to see whether NCLB actually drove those learning gains, and the answer, according to a number of studies, including one from Brian Jacob from our last panel, the answer was to some extent yes, at least in math and at least for some period of time. And yet, I also found that, not surprising anyone who lived during that era, No Child Left Behind had a great number of unintended consequences and drove a large political backlash. So, in my view, the folks who want more federal accountability now, they need to start thinking about how to design a better system. That was the conclusion from my recent piece. And I should say, because I've just started this new section at Chalkbeat, I'm still very much in shameless plug mode. So if you're interested, you can check out that story and follow our work by looking up Chalkbeat ideas. But I wanted to get Superintendent Wright, your take. We are officially here commemorating the 10th anniversary of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Should we be celebrating the 10th anniversary? Should we be declaring the law a failure, or somewhere in between?
Well, thank you for having me, by the way. I think your panelists really did a great job of summarizing the pluses and the minuses, of everything. I think the one thing that I cling to is the disaggregation of data, which I think has been huge. Obviously, that came out of NCLB, but I think the continuing focus on that is very important for student achievement. I also am a big accountability advocate. I think that if you've built a strong accountability system, because to me, accountability drives the behaviors that you want to see in schools. So what you put into your accountability system is supposed to do just that. And so I think it's important for parents and communities to know how well their schools are doing. So overall, I'm not the Debbie Downer where ESSA is concerned. I think it's got its pluses. I think the waivers, I think, certainly helped some districts and some states in terms of allowing more flexibility than NCLB did. I think one thing that's coming out of NCLB is the fact that we're now looking at student data in a more granular way than we have ever done before. And that, I think, is a big plus, whether that's NAEP data you're looking at or your own statewide assessment data. I think that's been a huge plus for us.
Obviously, you presided over the relative success or the success of a state in Mississippi that bucked the national trend, where everyone else has seen, almost everyone else has seen declining test scores in recent years. Mississippi has been an outlier in a positive direction. I'm wondering if you could describe in a little more detail what went right with the so-called Mississippi miracle. And this is kind of a selfish question as a journalist, what have those of us in the media gotten wrong about what we sometimes like to call the Mississippi miracle? Because many of us have written stories about it.
Well, it's so funny that you asked that. So number one, I'll tell you, it was not a miracle. It was a marathon. And so that's something that you achieve over a long period of time. You can't turn education, whether it's a state or a school or a district, around overnight. It's something that's got to be, you're in for the long haul, and you've got to be consistent about it. I think it's the selection of research-based strategies, number one. We leaned in very heavily and very early on to the science of reading, and that required a lot of professional learning for our teachers, general ed, special ed, our leaders, to make sure that they even knew what that was. Because what was coming out of teacher prep programs, I think even nationally, was a lot of a balanced literacy, which there has been no research to support, but people seem to advocate for that for whatever reason. And so we leaned in and made sure that all of our teachers and leaders were trained where that was concerned. We also developed some very strong standards. I mean, the learning standards in Mississippi, by the time I got there, had been evaluated, I think, by two different outside organizations, one of which referred to them as hideous, and the other ones referred to them as the worst in the nation. So we knew that we had to do something more rigorous for our children, because our kids were not being expected and being held to high standards in terms of content, et cetera. And we also built a very strong accountability system. I think I can't say enough about that, because I think one of the things that we did, we were not only looking at overall proficiency, but we were also looking at not just overall growth of all children, but growth of the bottom 25%. I mean, Mississippi was 50th and had been 50th or bounced between 49th and 50th for decades. And so we knew the majority of our children were down there, and we had to down at the bottom, that bottom quartile. And so we really had to start looking at who are those kids? I mean, I think that was the one thing when you talk about using data, I often said behind every data point is a face. Well, if you didn't know who that face was, you're not going to know what that child needed. So it's not like you can group them all together and say, well, all African-American children need X, or all students with disabilities need Y, because every child is different. And so it really got teachers looking at individual children, because when they got their data back, that was the first thing that they wanted to know, is who are those kids that need my help the most, and what specific help do they need? And I think also making sure that your teachers and leaders had the capacity to execute on that. So we leaned in very heavily, which the state had not done before, in professional learning and professional development for our teachers and our leaders. And that was consistent year after year after year after year. And in fact, I used my teacher advisory council to say, what else do you need? Like, what other help do you need in order to be a better teacher? And so when they would come back with, one time I was with a group of 400 of them, they said, writing, we need more help with writing. We think we've got the reading part down, but the kids are still struggling in writing. So we then created a lot of professional learning around writing. And what does that mean at the elementary level versus the middle level versus the high level? And so it was just a lot of consistent listening, and then providing what teachers and leaders were telling us that they needed.
So you've
And
moved.
monitoring the daylight out of data. Let me also say that. And monitoring the daylight out of data.
Okay, so yeah, I'll put you down as a data hawk and an accountability hawk.
Yes, yes.
So you moved back to, it's your home state, Maryland, right?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Okay.
it is.
Now, no pressure, but when can we expect the Maryland miracle to happen?
Well, it's
okay.
going to
I tease. So how's the Maryland marathon going?
How about the Maryland momentum? We're going to call it the
okay,
Maryland
great.
momentum.
We love alliterations. Okay.
Well, we're getting some momentum, that's for sure, because even when Maryland had been in the nation, you talked about the decade of loss. I was a principal, in Maryland for a long time. And so we were very much on any given year bumping heads with Massachusetts as to who was going to be number one nationally. And so to return to Maryland and find that we had dropped, if you're using NAEP, in 2013, Maryland was number 2 in the nation for 4th grade reading. And by 2022, they had dropped to 40th. And so we have rebounded in the 24 administration to 20th, but not nearly where we needed to be. And so that's the thing that that really kind of alarms me. People always say, well, what happened? And I don't know that I've got an explanation. I can tell you that as a state superintendent, for all those years, you look at every aspect of data that you have. And I know one of the panelists was talking about the importance of looking at K-2 data. That is huge. And having a universal screener at kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, which is what we had in Mississippi, and we're trying to move toward that in Maryland, gave us that kind of feedback about how little ones were doing prior to 3rd grade. We do have a kindergarten readiness assessment that we administer. So we do know how kids what they look like coming in versus what they look like when they're 1st grade ready. But I think that you've got to look at your NAEP data when that comes back. Is it mirroring your statewide data? Because that was not happening in Mississippi. Actually, it was rather alarming. When the honesty gap report came out, Mississippi was the poster child, because we were touting 65 to 70% of our kids were proficient in reading, only to find out when NAEP came out, you were looking at about 22 to 23%. So then I thought, well, something's not right. You can't have that big of a discrepancy. So when we finally dug into the assessment, which they had been using for years, and you researchers will appreciate this, somebody had put the proficiency cut at basic. So we were touting 65 to 70% of our kids were proficient, when in fact 65 to 70% of our kids were basic. So we put out an RFP for a brand new assessment, and to ensure, number one, that our kids were being assessed on what they're being expected to learn, but that we were actually measuring proficiency when we said we were measuring proficiency.
I want to get back to Mississippi and Maryland in a second, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about things in the news, most importantly, the potential closure of the education department. I'm interested in your thoughts on that broadly. Do you want it to be sent back to states? And specifically, have you seen any change so far under this new administration, good, bad, or indifferent?
Well, I don't think breaking up one department to send it to 4 or 5 different agencies, I don't think that's very efficient, because now you've got 4 or 5 different agencies that you're having to deal with versus just the one agency. I can tell you that the transfer of CTE to the Department of Labor did not go smoothly. In fact, there were 27 states, I think, that issued complaints about it because the money was not forthcoming. So that delay caused a problem. I have no problems making a decision in terms of education. I've got a strong state board and an amazing agency. That's not what bothers me. I think what bothers me is when you've got people that, like, inside an agency that are trying to find answers to questions, and now they're having to track down where these people are going. That's causing some kerfuffle. Let me put it to you that way. I mean, the money, like we said, that with CTE did not transfer as it was supposed to. So I worry that we're doing the same thing, but we're splitting it up 5 and 6 different ways versus housing it under one roof. But that being said, my biggest concern is making sure that we get the money that we're due. For the past 2 years, that has been less than each year. This year it was 8.5% less than last year. Last year it was 9% less than the year before. And I think that certainly is cause for concern. Right now we're waiting on about $180 million of ESSA money that we were promised that we're not getting yet. So there's the, I guess, the ups and downs with it all. I'm waiting to be a stronger proponent, but I'm going to need more evidence in order to go that direction.
During the last panel, there was some suggestion that we actually need more federal accountability. And, the research that I mentioned writing about suggests that during the No Child Left Behind era, when there was much more federal involvement than there is now, we saw gains, and some of it maybe was attributed to NCLB directly. Do you think we actually need a stronger federal hand, at least in school-based, test-based accountability, school accountability?
I do think you need a stronger hand in accountability. I worry that if you just say, well, a state can do whatever it wants, going to see some things happening that happened in a couple of states over the past few years, where they just start lowering the standard or lowering the cut score. And so you do children a disservice anytime you do not hold them to high standards, as you should hold yourself and the people that are responsible for them. I think you do children a disservice. Children can do and will do what you tell them they can do and will do, and help them get there. But the moment you back off and just say, well, let's just make it easier, that's not helping children in the long run. Children need to learn, we talked about the whole thing around problem solving. There's all those kinds of things about working in a team, being effective as a team member. I mean, all those skills are there, but you've got to have the content knowledge in order to also make your life worthwhile. It's not just enough to say, go along to get along. It's no, actually, you're going to be in a room with other adults at some point in time, and somebody's going to ask you an opinion on something, and you need to have that content knowledge in order to be able to be a contributing citizen.
Well, I mean, I think our conversation is a great example of it. I mean, we're throwing out acronyms left and right. I mean, I hope everyone can keep up with ESSA and ESSA and ESEA. And if you have that content knowledge, you know what we're talking about. But if you don't, you're totally, totally lost, even if you are abstractly a good critical thinker.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I mean, we kind of are in an era, I mean, where states can do whatever they want in terms of accountability, which I said that, not you. But, you know, everyone likes accountability in the abstract. You know, every voter is going to say, yeah, we need accountability. Every policymaker will say we need accountability. But like where No Child Left Behind went wrong or was derailed, was repealed, was because of the broad political backlash. I mean, what lessons do you take? Like what what specifically should we do to design a better accountability, more sustainable, fairer accountability system specifically?
Well, I think you've got to, I mean, you start with the goal in mind. I mean, it's just like what we build into an accountability system, whether it's Mississippi or Maryland, you know, it's a 4-year graduation rate. I mean, you need to know, are your schools producing children, graduating children on time? You know, if we look at college graduation rates, those graduation rates are usually hovering around the 50s. Well, what does that tell you when you're looking for how many kids are actually getting through for 4 years? And we also calculate a 5-year graduation rate. But I think the other things that you look at for accountability, don't we want to know how many children we have that are proficient in reading or proficient in math or proficient in science or social studies? I mean, don't we want to know how many kids are taking advanced placement classes and passing the exams? Don't we want to know how many are taking dual enrollment classes and are passing those as well? Don't we want to know about how they're performing SAT, ACT? So at least nationally, they can see themselves as to where, because they're not all going to live in your state forever. And so I think that we've got to think about what it is we want all kids to know and be able to do. And what do we owe these parents who entrust their children to us each and every day to ensure that we're producing those children that are going to be successful regardless of what they choose in life, whether they graduate and they go in the military, whether they go into an apprenticeship, whether they go to a 2 or 4-year university, it doesn't matter. All the skills that they need are almost the identical same thing. And so we need to make sure that we are producing those children so that they can be successful in life.
So what are the consequences for school that you think should be or that you've tried to implement in your states for schools that aren't doing a good job by whatever accountability measure you're using?
Oh, in Mississippi, we actually took over school districts. I mean, entire districts. When I first got there, they were using a model that was not successful in terms of placing a conservator there. And basically, the conservator was just to try and make sure that all of the accreditation standards got repaired, whether it was buses or buildings or things of that nature, and the numbers of books in a library, but nothing that was moving the needle. So I got the legislature to change that to where we had to put a superintendent in there who was focusing on instruction, and also that superintendent was going to remain in that district until that district was rated. We had an A through F system, rated C or higher for 5 consecutive years. That puts the focus on instruction. That puts the focus on the instructional core. What is happening with children and how much are children learning? And that changed everything in those districts that we took over, because now instruction was the key. And while they still had other accreditation issues that they may have to correct, the focus was on what are children learning each and every year.
I'm going to draw from some audience questions that build off what our conversation we've already had. If you had the opportunity to build a state PK through 12 assessment and accountability system from scratch, what is one thing you would definitely do and one thing you would definitely not do?
Well, I think one of your panelists hit on a note. I think whatever you do, PK through grade 12 has got to be developmentally appropriate. So what you would assess in pre-K is going to be with less amount of time than, let's say, what you might assess in 10th grade. But I think for me, it would be making sure that 2 things. One, I think there's a way to kind of get at the social kinds of things that we want all children to know and be able to do in terms of their social skills, their executive functioning skills, those kinds of things. What would that look like developmentally appropriately at a certain grade level? And then I think you do want to know about the content. You do want to know about, you know, the literacy and the numeracy, but you also want to give them an opportunity to show what do they know about solving problems, period. And that might be a great thing to think about in terms of social studies or even in science. So for me, it would be, I would love to have actually, you know, a look at each grade level, to be honest with you, rather than just 3 through 8 and one's in high school. That's one of the reasons that we started with a kindergarten reading assessment, or kindergarten, because our kindergarten assessment is reading and mathematics. So we kind of get an idea, but also what's we used in kindergarten, which I think is really important, is that that interaction between teachers and students, so that teachers get an idea of input about how kids are responding to different kinds of situations that they're put in. So the social aspect of that, I think, is important. I think COVID did not do us any favor by the isolation of children for the length of time that they were. I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing some of the behaviors, to be honest with you, that we're seeing in schools, because some schools were out, like Maryland was out for almost a year and a half. I mean, whereas Mississippi was just out from, I guess, around March, and then we started our school back in August. So we saw varying kinds of things of that, but not to the extent that I think that we've seen here.
I think in the last panel, someone raised, and I think it was maybe Brian, who raised this, what I see as a seeming paradox, which is that we know that from just a federal policy perspective, there's less test-based accountability pressure on schools than there used to be. Yet when I visit schools, which isn't as often as I would like, blame local press people who won't always let reporters in, but when I visit schools, I don't really get that sense, like, at least in terms of testing, like, there's still a lot of testing going on. Like, I still talk to principals who are like, here's my data wall, and oh, they're doing their iReady now, and here's their interim, and like, and I still hear from some parents like, oh, there's too much testing in schools. And so it sort of strikes me as like a bit of a paradox of like, we're still in a relatively high testing but low accountability environment. Do you think that's right as a descriptive analysis? And if so, like, what is your what do you think is the solution to that?
Yeah, I do. There's a certain amount of testing. We had a whole task force in Mississippi when this first came up, but come to find out, the majority of the testing that was being done was school-based testing.
Right.
The benchmark stuff. And what my concern is that you test for a reason. I once had a researcher say to me, there's no reason to measure if you're not going to adjust. And I think that is so true. So do we just test because it's now that's what we do? Or are we actually using this data to change what's happening instructionally in a classroom? That would be the question that I would ask. So as a principal, that was really what we wanted teachers to do. If you're administering a test, what does that reflect back to you as a teacher that either students still know or don't know? And how are you going to change your instruction based on the results that you get? I worry that we administer these tests, but then we don't really look at the data to inform the next sets of decisions that we make as teachers.
Here's another audience question. Maryland is a diverse state regionally, economically, culturally, and racially. How do you set priorities and standards that effectively meet the needs of all students? How do you work with county boards of education to set standards and meet goals? I'll just add my own spin on that, which is like, can you perhaps compare and contrast your experience in Maryland versus Mississippi?
Sure. Well, it's not the responsibility of local districts to set standards. That's a state responsibility, regardless of what state that you're in. That's a responsibility that's been given to the states. But in answer to your question about working with local districts, absolutely. Working with the superintendents is critical. I mean, I think I need to listen to them, because you're right. The folks that are on the shore have different needs than the folks that are in Western Maryland, or urban, if you're talking about Baltimore City. So I think you've got to listen to your constituents and your stakeholders, and then you got to react to that. It's not just enough to listen to it. Then I take all of this back with my team and say, okay, what is it that we can do or we can be doing to assist these superintendents with what their needs are? I think that we are gaining a number of multilingual learners children. And if that's the case, then we definitely need to be thinking about what are our general ed teachers need to know about how to deal with multilingual learners. Because fortunately, this was the case in Mississippi, we don't have enough multilingual learner teachers. So it really falls to the general ed teacher. So how are we providing them with professional learning in order to make sure that those kids are growing inside their classrooms as well? But the same can be said of special education too. I think you've got to be able to do both. You've got to be able to listen, and you've got to then be able to produce, because it's the superintendents, or if they're asking for something, it's my job to see with whatever we've got that we can provide it for them.
I want to ask you about one aspect of some of the success in Mississippi that has been touted as an aspect, which was grade retention. Maybe overly described as an aspect. We can get into that. But I think there is a lot of evidence, including a study out of Mississippi that shows that grade retention absolutely works to improve student learning and test scores. They get an extra year of education. They get an extra support oftentimes over the summer. But there's also some evidence that point to potential long-run negative effects of grade retention. There was just a paper out of Texas that showed, despite raising test scores, retained students were, by the time they reached high school, more likely to drop out. I'm wondering if you're concerned about potential negative effects of grade retention, and whether you can speak broadly about that issue and how you use that in Mississippi.
Well, it number one, it was written into law, so that was a part of it. Here in Maryland, we've got a parent choice in our policy, so teachers can still recommend that children get retained, but they're now required to have a meeting with the parents, show all data to the parent about why they're recommending that they be retained, and if the parent says yes, then that's fine. But we've got a different year of third grade for them. That's got to be something different. They don't just need another year of the same thing. And if they say no, then the parent signs either way, and the child goes to fourth grade. But there's got to be a commitment then to make sure that that child receives some additional help, whether it's summer school or in-school tutoring or something of that nature.
And do you support, sorry to interrupt, do you support the parental choice option in Maryland? Is that something?
Yeah, that was something we tried to put it in the policy. We floated it in the policy initially as just a plain retention. And I got feedback on both sides. Feedback from parents saying, do not ever retain my child, versus please retain my child if they're not reading on grade level. So we thought this was a good compromise for a parent choice. I think that for me, I worry more, to be honest with you, about us not ensuring that all children can read, because I can't imagine what it would be like to be a 15 or 16-year-old child and no ability to read. And because there's no way you can be successful in life if you cannot read. And I don't care what you want to do. I don't care what the skill is. I don't care what the job is. You've got to be able to read. And so for me, in Mississippi, I said to the team, we're not going to focus on retention. We're going to focus on prevention and intervention. That was going to be the focus with our teachers, prevention and intervention. So if you've got kids that are struggling, identify them early and make sure you're giving them the proper interventions in order to build their skills as readers. So that was the process that we used year in and year out, prevention and intervention. And we retained, a certain percentage of kids each year. But the study that came out of Boston University, I think is the one that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Did follow the kids that first cohort through, and they really did do better than the kids that had not been.
There have been some discussion about grade 8 reading scores in Mississippi. I've written a little bit about this, and the scores on grade 8 in Mississippi have held steady, whereas in the nation it's gone down. So Mississippi has done relatively better than the rest of the country in grade 8 reading, but it's less of a clear, the gains are less clear in grade 8 than in grade 4. And I'm wondering why you think that is. Do you think more time is needed? Do you think different strategies are needed, et cetera?
Yeah, I do think there's different strategies, and I'll tell you why. We did not, and you told me something we should have done, we didn't do. We are doing it here in Maryland, so lesson learned. We did not have an adolescent literacy policy. We weren't really talking about adolescent literacy in terms of what does that even look like for scheduling? Because when middle schools and high schools have very different schedules, very different master schedules than elementary schools do. And so we've got to then show, I think, folks what's possible on when intervention time can be built into a master schedule at both the middle school and the high school. So I do think it's a different strategy dealing with a middle school or high school student who's struggling with reading than it is a first grader. I mean, it just is. Now, that being said, do all kids need to know how to be able to decode? Absolutely. Do all kids need to know sound symbol relationship? Absolutely. So you've still got to make sure that even in the adolescent literacy policy that we're putting together, that we're meeting the needs of kids who really, really are struggling or simply cannot read, because then there are those foundational skills that they didn't learn that they're going to have to learn in middle school and again in high school.
This is another question from the audience. Policy can place restraints on what education systems do, give incentives to do different things, but rarely does it help build capacity to do the things educators don't yet know how to do. Does the Mississippi experience suggest that capacity building is much more important than the emphasis on incentives suggests?
I would say absolutely. I am a firm believer in building capacity. I think that teachers come in every day wanting to do their very best. I think that some come through the door with skills already set, and others can have those skills developed. And that is something that we did year in and year out, is working on building teacher capacity, particularly where it comes to both reading and mathematics, because our whole math policy is really built on expanding a lot of high school pathways. But I think that I can tell you that the teachers that came out of our professional learning were saying to me it was some of the best professional development that they'd ever received, because now it was like the light dawned, like, this is how you teach reading. This is what this means. And even when I was on the National Assessment Governing Board, there was a teacher that was on NAGB, and she said, she was a fourth grade teacher, and she said, Dr. Wright, I heard you talk so much about this training. And she says that I'm one of those teachers that always gets the kids that are struggling the most. So she said, I went through the training. And she goes, what a difference it made in my class. She goes, I cannot say enough about this training. And I thought, that's exactly what you want a teacher to know. Like, and she was an experienced teacher, but she said it was like the eye opened for her, like, this is what it all means. And so even in fourth grade, she then started building in a lot of the strategies around that the science of reading teaches. And so, and she says, my kids are just so much more successful than they were before. So it can be done. You've just got to make sure that it's consistent and it is done over time. And it is done for anybody and everybody that touches children.
Well, that speaks volumes that a veteran teacher would say that, because how often do veteran teachers leave professional development raving about how excellent they were? I can say perhaps not extremely often. Let's talk, we don't have a ton more time, but I do want to ask about because especially because you mentioned it, Mississippi's success in math, which I feel also has not really gotten quite the attention it deserves, because if you look at it, the gains are almost just as substantial as in reading. So what drove the Mississippi math miracle, or the Mississippi math marathon?
I think it's a direct link, I think, to reading as well, and the professional development, because that's the one thing that we were very consistent about, is making sure that that our teachers were being supported in the areas of mathematics. But I do think reading is the key to all subjects. And so once you can't very well solve quote unquote word problems, I'm going to refer to it as that, if you can't read the problem. And so I think the reading definitely impacted the math, and I think the professional learning and the building of capacity of teachers along with that also contributed to the growth in our math scores.
I want to ask a couple like nitty-gritty questions about like how to design accountability systems, since maybe some state leaders might be thinking about this. Are you a growth person or a proficiency person, or both? Like, okay, both should be. Got it.
Both should be. And we're working right now. We've been working because I had a lot of folks complaining about our current assessment and accountability system when I came to Maryland. So I put a task force together in 2024 And so based on those recommendations, they're feeding that into our RFP that went out for our brand new assessment. And we're working on our accountability system. And the Center for Assessment, which I can't say enough about, out of New Hampshire, they're an amazing group of people. And so they have been working with us the entire time I've been here. So we will have a new assessment system, and we hopefully will be able to change some of our statute, because somebody wrote this into statute, the accountability system. And so we're hoping that we can get some statute change to make our accountability system even stronger.
Do you think do you think schools should receive an A through F letter grade?
Well, to me, it was simple in Mississippi. I mean, every parent knows what A through F means. I mean, it's just a simple way of doing it. But once again, this was one of the things that was written into Maryland state statute, that we cannot use an A through F system. Don't ask me why. So we're having to figure out now, and then what are we going to call it, right? Right now, we've got a star system. We've got a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 system. And so we may just keep that for simplicity. But every parent knows what an A is. Every parent knows what an F is. And so for me, the communication was much easier.
How many things are written into state statute that says you can't do what you want to do in Mississippi?
You mean in Maryland?
In Maryland, yeah, exactly.
A lot. So we've been working with our stakeholders on this, and the committee that I put together is really broad-based, and everybody was coming together saying the exact same thing, which was really helpful, because you had a lot of different perspectives. You know, it was a large group and a lot of different perspectives on it, and people were like finally like understanding why we were shooting for some of the stuff that we're shooting for.
I'll ask one more question, and then we have to wrap up. And this is again from the audience, and this might be a tricky question, or maybe we've already said it. It's, what is one important innovation ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, spurred that should be protected, elevated, invested in, and scaled, and why?
I don't know if it would started. I mean, I guess it started in NCLB, but I'm just a big accountability person. I just need you to know that. I mean, I hold myself accountable. I hold my team accountable. As a principal, I held myself accountable, hold my teachers accountable. I mean, these are children's lives we're talking about. And I think we need to keep coming back to that. This isn't just your day job that you come into and you go home at the end of the day and, you know, that kind of thing. These are children's lives that we are dealing with each and every day. And for me, each day's got to be the best it can be, because when the day ends, you can't get that day back, and they can't get that day back. So what are we doing each and every day to make sure that kids are getting everything that they need in order to be successful in life? And that to me, it comes back to accountability. We've got to be held accountable for ensuring that our children are going to be successful.
Superintendent Carey Wright, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you from the Brookings Institution and from the Hamilton Project to all of you who joined us. What a rich conversation. Thanks to those of you who sent questions, and I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
You too. Bye.